Hello, dear viewer. Welcome to your favorite program, The Knowledge Quest. Time for History and Government. Your teacher, Mr. Obara Alex. Welcome. We have been discussing history, and our topic of discussion has been Agrarian Revolution. In our previous topic, we discussed about Agrarian Revolution and how it came about. We saw what actually Agrarian Revolution is. Just a reminder, Agrarian Revolution refers to the rapid changes and developments in the field of agriculture. Now, therefore, today we shall now go into details and look at the spread of Agrarian Revolution. It began way back in Britain, then went to other countries or other places in the world. So therefore, our discussion today is the spread of Agrarian Revolution. The spread of Agrarian Revolution. So after Agrarian Revolution beginning in the 1750s in Britain, it eventually spread to Europe, the entire Europe, and of course to the Americas and eventually to the rest of the world. Ideas like crop rotation, which we discussed in Agrarian Revolution, ideas like use of machines, ideas like selective breeding, and of course ideas like the use of fertilizers, spread out. They spread out from Britain, and eventually they went to the rest of the world. And of course the field of agriculture continued on to develop, and we have scientists who came out like Louis Pasteur. I think you've heard this one, Louis Pasteur. This guy was a French scientist, and he was able to discover that diseases were caused by bacteria. And of course he discovered that sterilization, for example, sterilizing milk, could be keeping that milk free from bacteria. So guys like Louis Pasteur came in, and this eventually led to the spreading of revolution, changes and development in the field of agriculture. So this guy, I think you've learned in Form 1, whereby we said, actually in Form 2, whereby we say this guy discovered things like sterilization, and of course he discovered the role of bacteria. The role of bacteria, that is, bacteria can cause diseases, but we can prevent bacteria into getting into foods like milk through sterilization of that very given milk. So that is actually a short explanation how Agrarian Revolution continued. Now we shall pick a case study that is in the USA, and we shall see how Agrarian Revolution developed and actually spread throughout the USA, that all the United States of America. So our short topic today will be Agrarian Revolution in the USA, or the United States of America. Agrarian Revolution in the United States of America. So we'll start with the USA. The spread of Agrarian Revolution in the United States of America. So generally it is known that America, or the Americas, is known to be in the world as the origin of so many crops. Actually, in that case, subsistence crops. The American Indians were subsistence farmers, and they grew a number of crops. For example, crops like yams. Those were grown in America. Crops like maize, or we call them corn. They were grown in America. Talk about potatoes. Those were grown in America. Talk about cotton. Those are examples of crops. Talk about crops like tobacco. Talk about beans and cassava. Beans and cassava. All these are crops which were actually grown in America by the Indian American subsistence farmers. So you realize that because of what referred to as the political and religious difference in Europe during the 17th century, many Christians or many Europeans decided to run into America. Actually, the original inhabitants of America referred to as the Red Indians. But you realize that because of the political and religious persecutions during the 17th century, many Europeans ran into America for refuge. They ran and settled in America, and therefore they were able to enclosure, or rather to bring about the system that was initially in Britain. So therefore we realize that craftsmen, laborers, all those moved in search of a better life. So immigrants, all those guys basically were running away from political and religious persecutions, came and settled in America. And in the ancestors they were coming, they were able to come with different animals and crops. For example, they came with animals like the horses. These were brought about by the immigrants who came to the US. They brought animals like sheep. They brought along them animals like pigs. They brought fowls. We also had other seeds and plants which were brought along by the migrants who are running away from what we call the political and religious persecution. So a lot of machineries, of course, some participate in improving the machines that were already in use in Europe. So those actually who ran from Europe to America were also involved in developing the machines which were initially used in Europe. For example, we have a guy called John Deere. In 1837, a guy called John Deere. This guy, a young blacksmith from Illinois, invented steel plow. He invented steel plow. So instead of using a plow which was formed out of wood, he invented steel plow. We also have another guy called Cyrus McCormick in 1837 also. 1837, Cyrus McCormick. He was able to establish a factory in Chicago which was to produce reapers. So his factory was to produce reapers. These are machines which are used in reaping. Of course, also in the same year, 1837, a guy called Daniel Massey. 1837, the same year, a guy called Daniel Massey. Daniel Massey. He produced a similar machine in Canada. So you realize that there were various developments which were done in Agrarian Revolution, of course, in regards to agriculture. So various machines were developed. So we realize that Americans were also, they were enterprising kind of citizens. They were working hard to bring about Agrarian Revolution. So there were major milestones which were done. Of course, after this Agrarian Revolution, we had various things occurring in America. And one of the most significant things I want us to note, that America now was subdivided into various regions. It was divided into various regions simply because of the differences in soil fertility and climate. Therefore, each zone in America was to produce different kind of goods or products. For example, the northeastern parts of America. So we had what called the zoning of America. Zoning of the USA into different regions. So because of the various, we said, climatic differences and of course differences in soil fertility, various areas were zoned. That meaning that various soils were suitable for different kind of crops. For example, we said the northeastern parts of America were suitable for ranching and dairy farming. They were suitable for ranching and dairy farming. So that area, the kind of crops or the kind of soil and the kind of climate was supporting ranching and dairy farming. Then we have the south. The south of America was suitable for cotton zone. It was referred to as the cotton zone. That is, the kind of soil which was in this zone was suitable. It was suitable for growing of cotton in that case. Then we had the central region. The central region. This central region was specifically suitable for corn or maize growing. So it was suitable for maize, or we can call it corn. It was suitable for corn growing. And then lastly, we have the northwest region. The northwest region. This one was suitable for what we refer to as wheat. So because the Americas as continents are so big, therefore they were able to zone these areas into these different parts because of the difference in climate and the difference in soil fertility. So actually, you realize that there was also large-scale mechanization, especially at this period we had what referred to as abolition of slave trade. Actually, slave trade was abolished during this era between the 17th century. Therefore, most of the crops were grown by use of machines, or planted and actually harvested by use of machines. Therefore, the abolition of slave trade in some sense encouraged agrarian revolution, because now human beings were not being used as much in farming or in provision of labor, but machines were being used. So various industries were established in areas like Virginia and Maryland, and of course we had tobacco being grown there. Areas like indigo, Georgia and South Carolina, we had crops like rice being grown, and cattle were also reared in places like Texas. So you realize these areas were zoned depending on the climate and the type of soil. And you also realize that a guy called Alexander Graham Bell, for those who have heard this guy, various inventions assisting agrarian revolution in America. So Alexander Graham Bell discovered a telegraph. Alexander Graham Bell. He discovered a telegraph. So the telegraph was important because it also enhanced communication. Therefore, it was easy for farmers and the owners of farms to communicate and to enhance the growth of agriculture in that sense. So therefore, of course, you also had development in transport. It enhanced agriculture. For example, talk about water transport, talk about the use of Great Lakes and rivers, and of course, railway. All these enhanced agriculture because now it was easy for the transportation of commodities from various places to other places. US also invested largely in the field of science and research. So therefore, apart from all those inventions, they invested largely on the field of science and research, which enhanced and boosted agriculture with better hybrid seeds and different strains of livestock. So therefore, you realize that because they majorly invested, they gave a lot of money and finance in agriculture. These assisted in the process of improving agriculture. So after looking at that short background information on the USA, we shall look at factors that facilitated the development of agriculture in America before 1800. Factors that facilitated the development of agriculture in America before 1800. factors that facilitated the development of agriculture in USA before 1800. So we'll look at what are the factors which actually facilitated agriculture, or I can say agrarian revolution basically, or development of agriculture in USA before 1800. So the first one, the introduction of the enclosure system in Britain. Remember what we said, that with the introduction of the enclosure system, the peasants were rendered landless. Therefore, they went out as immigrants. So we can say the settlement of enterprising European immigrants. So the first one, settlement of enterprising European immigrants. So what we mean here, that those guys or those peasants and the serfs who ran as a result of lack of land, they were enterprising. That is, they wished to make a living through agriculture. They were determined to succeed, and therefore they saw agriculture as the only source of livelihood. So they were able to develop agriculture in America, and they came with those skills. They were able to introduce new farming skills. They introduced new crops and livestock, in that case, which of course led to development of agriculture in America. So the first reason we can say why agriculture developed in America is the influx or the coming in of immigrants, who eventually we realized that they were enterprising. They were ready to work and develop agriculture. Number two, scientific research. Scientific research. So you realize that the scientific research, like we said, America heavily invested in the field of research and agriculture, in that case in America. So this research, of course, led to the improvement of the various strains of crops, which were able to resist diseases, and of course to develop superior animal breeds, and of course also to develop new crops. For example, because of the research in science, we had crops like soybeans, which were turned into artificial meat, which we call soy meat. So this was as a result of the scientific research in America. Number three, another factor which actually led to the growth or development of agriculture in America was mechanization. Mechanization, we call it the use of machines. So they used extensively, there was extensive use of machines to improve production. There was extensive use of machines to improve production. For example, we had steel plows. We also have use of reapers and cotton gin. All these were actually used in improvement of agriculture. So mechanization of use of machines improved, or rather led to development of agriculture in America. Also, number four, we had the presence of cheap means of transport. Cheap means of transport. So, of course, transport is important because we said through transport you're able to transport our commodities and agricultural products from the farm to the factories, of course, finished products from the factories to the market. So therefore, with the presence of cheap means of transport, for example, the Erie Canal, called the Erie Canal. Of course, a canal we know is a man-made way of connecting, of course, two different water bodies. So we have the Erie Canal, we had railway. All this speeded up the transportation of raw materials and, of course, of goods to and fro, to the industries and from the industries. And then number 5, we have the invention of the cotton gin. Number 5, invention of the cotton gin. It led to the increased cotton acreage. So this machine, which was of course invented, it was important in the sense that because now it was there, of course, to process cotton. So therefore, the guys were excited in that case, and cotton production increased. So the acreage of producing cotton increased. So therefore, we look at another factor. We also have environmental influence in the farming. Like we saw earlier, there was what called zoning. So because of that, farmers did what called specialization. So we realized that various areas. So let me say the next factor is what called environmental influence. Number 6. Environmental influence. Environmental influence on the farmers through experience leading to agricultural zoning. So for example, we have the maize center, we have wheat, maize in the center, we have wheat in the south, and beef rearing in the west. And of course, we had suitable soils of different crops like cotton and wheat. So the environmental influence also led to development of agriculture. So areas were zoned. So we had areas of maize, areas of cotton, areas of livestock, and various areas. And then we look at the last factor which led to development of agriculture is the governmental recognition of what we refer to as individual land ownership. That is number 6. Number 7, recognition of individual land ownership. So in this case, you realize that the government of America, through what called the Homestead Act of 1760, realized that individuals could own land individually. And this encouraged guys to develop farming. We are going for a short break. We'll back in a little while. Don't touch the dial. Welcome back. History and Government, the Knowledge Quest. I'm your teacher still, Mr. Obara Alex. So we are on still with the spread of Agrarian Revolution, and we are discussing about Agrarian Revolution in the USA. And of course, we looked at the factors which facilitated the development of agriculture in the USA before 1800. Now we want to look at now the effects of Agrarian Revolution in the USA. The effects of Agrarian Revolution in the USA. So it's important that you've noted that Agrarian Revolution spread from Britain eventually to the USA. So it begins in Europe, then goes to the Americas. So we look at effects of Agrarian Revolution in the USA. What were the effects? Effects of Agrarian Revolution in the USA. Effects of Agrarian Revolution in the USA. So Agrarian Revolution, of course, we said, like we said earlier, the changes in development in agriculture, and of course, all those like using machines and all those, it's Agrarian Revolution. So what were the effects of Agrarian Revolution in the USA? So number 1, it led to what we refer to as diversification of agriculture. Number 1, led to diversification of agriculture. That is, that with the introduction of different animals, with the introduction of different crops, there was diversification in that we had guys now who were specializing in agriculture, let's say in animal farming. We had those who were specialized in crop production. So as a result of agrarian revolution, we had different guys diversifying in agriculture. Of course, number two, the new inventions in the machinery enabled Americans to bring more land into cultivation. So number two, more land, more American land was brought into cultivation. So this implies that with the invention of various machines, like we saw, with the invention of various machines like the steel plow by John Deere, reaping machines like by Comic, all these made this American land to be brought under cultivation. And then we have there was increase in food production. Increase in food production. That is obvious. Increase in food production. So you realize that since the machines were more efficient and the farming methods of like use of fertilizers, use of hybrid seeds, these were more productive. So therefore it led to what referred to as increase. More food were produced, like for example, talk about wheat and maize. There was large production of crops like wheat and maize specifically because of the machines. Wheat and maize, or call it corn. So all this increased as a result of agrarian revolution in America. Number four, it led to expansion of agriculture-related industries. Number four, agrarian revolution led to expansion of agriculture-related industries. So in other words, we say it led to growth of industries or industrialization. So we realized that there were various industries which developed. For example, those industries which were of course being used in industries like cotton, for example, maize, all those industries developed. So there was expansion of agricultural related industries. Then of course, number five, expansion or mechanization of agriculture replaced slave trade. So there was replacement of slave trade. Or actually say it led to the end of slave trade. So slave trade was replaced with legitimate trade in that case. So there was a replacement of slave trade and slave laborers who were supposed to provide labor in the farms, and many people now went to search for employment in the urban areas. And then of course there was expansion of trade. You can say growth of trade. So in this case we are referring to the trade in this case of the products which are being produced actually from the farm. So for example, talk about corn. So if America was producing corn, they could easily exchange those commodities which they have with the Western Europe in that case to improve. And this actually led to the improvement of the economy of the USA as a result of trade. And then also we have the transport system was improved. By default, you know that all these commodities need to be transported. So as a result of agrarian revolution, we had improvement of the transport system. Improvement of the transport system. So you realize that the transport system was to enable farmers to transport their inputs and of course the outputs from or the produce from the farm and of course to the markets. Therefore, many roads were developed, which enabled transportation of all these commodities. And then you realize that also we had the last effect is that the revolution contributed to enhancement of research. So it contributed to enhancement. That is, more research was done, contributed to enhancement of more research. So guys, you realize that scientific inventions were made mostly during the 17th century and 18th. So it contributed to the enhancement of more research, and basically that research was to be in the agricultural field. So basically those are the effects of agrarian revolution in the USA, and basically that was the area which we chose to look into. So somebody could be wondering, what about Africa? Because we talked about Europe, we've talked about the US or the Americas. What about Africa? So we shall look at the food situation in Africa and the rest of the third world countries. What is the food situation? Is agrarian revolution of effect in Africa and the third world countries like Asia, South America, and Africa, or is actually the case same with those Americas? So that takes us to a new topic, that is the food situation in Africa and the rest of the third world. The food situation in Africa and the rest of the third world. Now, initially, we used to refer to the third world countries as underdeveloped, but that is not correct. It is the developing nations. We refer to them as developing because development is a continuous process. So we don't say underdeveloped, but they are developing countries. So we say the food situation in Africa and the rest of the third world countries. So these countries, we refer to them the developing countries. Developing, they are referred to as the developing countries. And these developing countries basically come from Africa. We have Africa. We have Asia. And I know you can give examples of countries in each. For example, Africa is Kenya. So we have other countries in Asia. We have South America. So these ones are referred to as the third world countries or the developing countries. They are still in the process of development. And you realize that most of these countries, their food situation is that they have shortages of food supply. And actually, these has led to their weak economies to date. You realize that the economies of African states, Asian countries, and most of the South African countries and South American countries are still weak. The reason is there is still not enough food to give the people, because food is important for provision of energy. Anybody who wants to work must eat. Of course, you have to work if you want to eat. So therefore, these countries are still in the process of developing and the economies are extremely weak. So what could be the causes of food shortages in these countries? And basically, let us talk about Africa. The causes of food shortages in Africa. Causes it's just the other day that Kenyans were hailing and crying about food and hunger in some parts of the country. So you realize it's a real issue that is facing Africa. So what are the causes of food shortage in Africa? So the first one is rapid population growth. Rapid population growth. What is the impact of rapid population growth? When we have a lot of population, or we have a large population, it puts a lot of pressure on the available food resources, and therefore this leads to shortage. So it means that if we're having a rapid population growth, then it means also our food must increase to meet the population, but that is not the case. So therefore you realize you have rapid population growth, which has led to pressure on the available, actually scarce. So guys are competing on the scarce food resources. That leads to shortage of food in Africa. Number two, we have poor land use and agricultural practices. Poor land use and agricultural practices. So some of the practices which are being used to date probably are the Stone Age period practices which were used by the Stone Age man. So those poor land use practices actually lead to poor production. So you realize that farmers are still depending on the traditional farming methods. For example, they don't apply fertilizers, no use of pesticide, no mechanization. Actually, some use sticks and stones. So those are poor agricultural practices. And also this leads to production of poor or low yields. And then we also have another cause of food shortage in Africa. Some developing countries experience adverse weather conditions. So we have number 3, adverse So you realize that sun and rainfall are important. But now when sun goes to the extreme or rain goes to the extreme, it becomes adverse. So you realize that some countries are experiencing adverse weather conditions. For example, we have flooding. So when you have flooding, you know what is the impact of flooding. Flooding will come and will sweep away the crops, probably will destroy them. And also we have long periods of drought. Long periods of drought. Very dry conditions. So these countries depend mostly, for example, Africa or Kenya, we depend on rain. So if there is no rain and we have not gone to the way of maybe carrying out irrigation, you realize we have drought, and this drought is going to destroy, actually will make the land unproductive, and therefore you realize that by essence food production is affected, it goes low, and that leads to food shortage in Africa. And then we have another effect, number 4, overemphasis on cash crop at the expense of food crops. Overemphasis on cash crop. You realize that most guys are trading away food crop for cash crop. Guys are being encouraged to carry out cash crop farming. So they'll be growing crops like tea, coffee, cotton, and all those at the expense of food crops. So you realize most land has been put on the use of cash crop. And therefore you realize that food production goes low, and therefore guys are supposed actually to do the other way around. But in Africa, it's the opposite. Why? Because people are interested more on money than on food. So therefore, that actually is a big reason, it's a challenge. So therefore, it leads to a food shortage in Africa. Then number 5, we have rural-urban migration. Rural-urban migration. Rural-urban migration, actually, this in a big sense affects the young Turks, the young people. because they move to the urban areas with a sense of looking for white-collar jobs. Rural urban migration. So the young people move with the mind of getting white-collar jobs. Maybe they want to work in offices. They want to be Dutch. So therefore, at the expense, you realize that we don't have enough workforce in the rural areas who are supposed to work on the farms and produce food which actually is supposed to be used in these towns. So you realize that yes, these guys are working to get money, but this money is not assisting because we don't have enough food in Africa. So rural urban migration should be capped, should be stopped. So that is another cause of food shortage in Africa. The next one, a lack of adequate capital. Lack of adequate capital for agricultural development. We can also say poverty. So poverty in this case, guys, not have enough funds. These funds are supposed actually to be used in purchase of farm inputs like seeds. Talk about hybrid seeds. Like talk about fertilizer. Talk about the livestock which is being used which we rear. So because there is lack of adequate capital which is caused as a result of poverty, or you can say low income. Yeah, because these developing countries, like we said, they survive on less than $2 in a day. That's very little money. So we have low income. As a result of that, agriculture won't develop because the farmers do not have enough money to buy the farm inputs for development of agriculture. Then the next point, and the cause of food shortage in Africa, is political instability. Political instability. So some African countries undermine food production. For example, in a country like Ethiopia, Sudan, Deere Congo, and Rwanda, these countries are faced. For example, Rwanda, you know what happened during the genocide? Many people were killed in that case. So where there is no peace, of course, guys can't work to produce food. So countries, for example, in Kenya, we had our own share of the same experience during the 2007 and 8 post-election violence. So this prevents people from concentrating on food production to concentrating on how they can be safe and secure. So therefore, that leads to the less or shortage of food in Africa. That is food production. So we say political instability. So political stability is very important. And of course, those guys would want to invest in a country, take into consideration political stability. If there is no political stability, they won't come. And that in effect will affect food production. All right, the next cause of food shortage is decline in growing drought-resistant crops. Decline in growing drought-resistant crops. So there are crops that are drought-resistant. They can resist drought, but guys have chosen not to grow those crops. Crops like cassava and millet are drought-resistant, but because of the poor attitude that people have towards cassava, so crops like cassava and millet, they're drought resistant, but because of the poor attitude that people have, people would rather eat maize flour than eat cassava flour or millet flour. So, and that in the expense, it leads to poor or rather food shortage in Africa. So in a nutshell, those are some of the factors which have led to shortage of food in Africa. And the last one, we talk about poor and inadequate storage facilities. For today, we talk about that one as the last one. Poor storage, poor and inadequate storage facilities. So you realize that African countries have not invested in proper storage facilities. So you realize that food will go bad. We produce a lot of food, but this food will go bad within a short period. For example, during the year 2001, the country lost up to 9 million bags of grain, as a result of poor storage facilities. So those are some of the factors which lead to shortage of food in Africa. And that marks the end of our lesson today. I'd like that next time we meet again as we continue looking at the food situation in Africa and probably some of the solutions which we can propose to the African and more specifically the Kenyan government to put in place so as to increase food production in Africa. Until then, see you and keep safe. Goodbye.